There's a woman named Carol who told me something I have never forgotten. The first time a young cashier called her sweetheart in that syrupy, careful voice, the one people reserve for toddlers and nervous dogs. She didn't say a word. She paid. She smiled. She walked to her car. And then she sat there for almost 20 minutes and cried. Not because the word itself was cruel, because in that moment, she understood that the boy hadn't actually looked at her. Not really. He had looked at her white hair, her slower hands, the cane leaning against the cart, and in half a second, without asking her a single question, he had decided exactly who she was. And here is the part that took her years to say out loud, even to herself. Some mornings she was starting to believe him. So today I want to ask you something most people never say out loud. When did you stop being seen? And is it possible, even now, to get that back? Here's what I want to walk through with you today. 8 reasons why the world starts seeing your hair before it sees you, and 8 quiet ways to take your identity back, piece by piece. We'll talk about the moment you become invisible in public, about being folded into one flat word like elderly, as if that explains anything about who you are, about the strange gap between the person you feel like inside and the person staring back from the mirror, about losing the role that used to organize your whole day, and about what actually gets remembered long after the hair color stops matching at all. Stay with me. This one gets personal fast. Reason number 1 is the moment you become invisible in public, and it happens more often than you'd like to admit. Think about the last time you stood in a checkout line, or waited at a pharmacy counter, or tried to ask a question in a crowded store. Did the person actually look at you? Or did their eyes slide past your face, like you were part of the furniture? This isn't usually cruelty. That's the strange, uncomfortable truth of it. Most of the time, nobody in that store woke up planning to erase you. What's actually happening is quieter and, in some ways, harder to fight because it's invisible itself. Psychologists call it categorical seeing. The brain, when it's busy or distracted, doesn't process a stranger as a full person with a history and a voice and opinions. Processes a category instead. Young mother, delivery driver, and, for you, older person, a label that, in a fast-moving culture obsessed with speed and youth, quietly gets filed under irrelevant. Not important. Not worth the extra half-second of eye contact. There's a psychological concept called the looking glass self. The idea that a large part of how we know who we are comes from how other people reflect us back. A smile. A moment of real attention. A question that assumes you have something worth saying. When that reflection disappears, when the room simply stops looking, something in you starts to quietly wonder if you disappeared too. You didn't. But the silence can feel like proof that you did. And that's the part nobody warns you about. It's not one dramatic moment of being dismissed. It's the slow accumulation of 100 small ones, until you start walking into rooms already bracing to not be seen. There's an older sociological term for a gentler cousin of this, civil inattention. The polite, brief acknowledgement strangers give each other in public without staring. A nod, a half glance. Enough to say, silently, I register that you exist. What changes as you get older isn't that people become rude. It's that even that small, polite acknowledgement starts to thin out, until some days it disappears altogether. And here's what makes it sting in a way it never used to. For most of your life, you had other things doing the work of being seen for you. A uniform, a title on a badge, a toddler on your hip that made strangers smile automatically. Those were never really about you either, but they carried attention toward you as a side effect. Retirement, widowhood, an empty house, they don't just remove a role. They quietly remove the props that used to earn you that glance. What's left is just you, unescorted, walking into a pharmacy and finding out, maybe for the first time in decades, whether the world will look at you for no reason at all except that you're a person standing in front of it. That's not vanity. That's a basic, healthy human need to be witnessed, and it doesn't expire at any age. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If strangers stopped reflecting you back tomorrow, would you still know exactly who you are without them? Keep that question in your back pocket because it's going to matter a lot more by the end of this video. For now, here's the first piece of the puzzle. The world's inattention was never actually evidence about your worth. It was only ever evidence about the world's habits. And habits, unlike people, can be challenged. Reason number 2 is closely tied to the first one, but it cuts even deeper because it's not about being overlooked. It's about being replaced with a label. There's a word that does a strange kind of violence, and it doesn't even sound unkind. Elderly, senior, sometimes even grandma or grandpa, said by someone who has never once asked what you actually want to be called. One word, standing in for 70, 80, 90 years of decisions, heartbreaks, jokes only you would make, a career you built, a marriage you survived or didn't, 100 versions of yourself nobody in that room ever met. This is what researchers who study aging call elderspeak. The tendency to talk to older adults in a simplified, slower, more sing-song tone, the same tone used with small children, regardless of whether the person has any cognitive difficulty at all. Sounds gentle. It often comes from people who mean well. But underneath the gentleness is a quiet assumption that your complexity has been resolved, filed, closed, that there's nothing new left to learn about you, so a simple word will do. Here's what almost nobody says clearly enough. A label is not a biography. Senior tells someone your approximate age bracket. It says nothing about the fact that you once talked your way out of a layoff or raised a child alone, or learned to play piano at 62 just because you finally had the time, or fell in love twice, or once drove 12 hours through a snowstorm because somebody needed you. All of that gets quietly zipped inside one flattening word, and the person using it usually has no idea how much they just erased. The tragic part is how easily this label gets absorbed. Hear it enough times, from enough strangers, enough clerks, enough well-meaning young relatives, and some people start introducing themselves that way too, as if elderly were a personality instead of a number. Think about how strange this would sound in any other context. Nobody looks at a 35-year-old and says, "Ah, a middle-aged." It would sound absurd, because we instinctively know a 35-year-old contains multitudes. A job, a temper, a sense of humor, opinions about music, a whole unfinished story. But somewhere past a certain birthday, the culture quietly stops requiring itself to imagine the rest of the story. The label becomes a stopping point instead of a starting one. And the cruelest part isn't the word itself. It's what the word gives people permission to skip. Once someone decides elderly is the whole answer, they stop asking follow-up questions. They stop being curious about your opinion on the news, your take on a book, what you actually think about your grandchild's choices, because the label already told them falsely that they know enough. You end up being spoken about in the third person while standing right there, or spoken to in short, simple sentences, as though your vocabulary shrank along with, perhaps, your patience for being underestimated. That's not accuracy. That's erasure wearing a polite voice. If you're still with me, I want you to notice something. We've only covered 2 reasons, and already this might be landing somewhere tender. That's exactly right. Keep going anyway, because reason number 3 is where this starts to turn inward, into something even more personal. Here's where segment 2 leaves off. Even if the whole world settled on calling you by one flat word, there's still the matter of what you call yourself in the quiet, when nobody else is in the room. Have you ever caught your reflection in a store window, just for a half second, and genuinely not recognized who was looking back? Not because anything is wrong with you, but because the face in the glass doesn't match the person you feel like on the inside? This gap has a name in psychology: subjective age as opposed to chronological age. And the research on it is almost startling. Across dozens of studies on aging, most adults over 60 consistently report feeling, on average, somewhere between 10 and 20 years younger than their actual age. Not as denial, but as an honest internal experience. The part of you that finds things funny, that gets nervous before a phone call, that still wants to learn something new, that still remembers exactly what it felt like to be 25 and certain the whole world was ahead of you. That part didn't age at the same speed as your hands or your hairline. It's still in there, fully intact, sometimes shockingly close to the surface. So when the mirror shows silver hair and lines the culture has taught you to read as decline, and the person inside is still curious, still funny, still stubborn, still exactly you, that mismatch isn't a malfunction. It's actually one of the most well-documented, universal experiences of growing older. Almost everyone who reaches your age feels it. The tragedy isn't the gap itself. The tragedy is believing the mirror is more honest than your own lived experience of yourself, letting a reflection outvote 70 years of evidence about who you actually are. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes with this, one that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't lived it. You catch a photo someone else took of you. Not the flattering one you'd have chosen, just a candid, unguarded shot. And for a split second there's a stranger in it. Then recognition catches up, a beat too late, and with it comes a small, disorienting grief that has nothing to do with vanity. It's the grief of time moving faster on the outside than it ever felt on the inside. But here's what's worth remembering in that exact moment. Photographs and mirrors only ever capture a single frozen instant. They cannot capture tone of voice, the particular way you tilt your head when you're skeptical of something, the timing of your laugh, the specific warmth in your eyes when someone you love walks into a room. All of that, the actual living texture of you, exists only in motion, only in time, which means no still image was ever equipped to hold the whole truth of you in the first place. That's not confusion. That's your identity refusing, quietly and stubbornly, to shrink down to match a photograph. If this is the part where you feel a small ache of recognition, good. Hold on to that ache gently, because reason number 4 is going to ask something harder of you. What happens when the very thing that used to answer, "Who am I?" gets taken away entirely? Maybe it was the day you cleaned out your desk. Maybe it was the morning after the last child moved out and the house went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Maybe it was a diagnosis or a driver's license you didn't get to renew. Whatever the specific door was, you know the moment I mean. For most of adult life, identity gets built partly on role. I'm a nurse. I'm somebody's mother. I'm the one who fixes things at work. These roles aren't just job titles, they're scaffolding. They tell you what to do when you wake up, who needs you, what your day is for. And when a role like that ends, through retirement, an empty nest, widowhood, illness, or simply time, the scaffolding doesn't get gently replaced. It just comes down, sometimes all at once, and what's left standing is a much rawer question. Who am I when I'm not needed by anyone in the specific way I used to be needed? This is one of the most under-discussed griefs of growing older, because it doesn't look like grief from the outside. Nobody sends a card. There's no funeral for a job title or a season of parenting. But the disorientation is real, and it's well documented in research on retirement and role loss. A measurable dip in sense of purpose, right in the exact window when society expects you to simply enjoy your free time. Here's the quiet truth underneath it. The role was never the whole of who you were. It was one expression of deeper things, your competence, your care for others, your discipline, your creativity, and those deeper things didn't retire along with the title. They're still fully yours. They're just waiting for a new shape to pour into. It helps to notice what actually made you good at the role in the first place, because that's the part that survives its ending. The nurse's real gift was never the badge. It was a kind of attentiveness, a steadiness under pressure, a way of noticing when someone was in pain before they said so. The parent's real gift was never the daily logistics of school runs and packed lunches. It was patience and fierce loyalty, and the ability to make a frightened child feel safe with nothing but a tone of voice. Roles are containers. What they contained is portable. It can be poured into a grandchild, a neighbor going through something hard, a volunteer shift, a friendship that needed exactly the steadiness you spent 30 years building. The disorientation after a role ends is real and shouldn't be rushed past. But underneath the disorientation is usually a quieter, more patient question waiting to be asked. Not who am I now that the role is gone, but where does everything I built inside that role want to go next? That's not emptiness. That's a wide open field where a smaller, more crowded room used to be. I want to pause here for a second because if you're still with me at this point, this next part matters even more than what came before it. We're a little past the halfway mark now, and this is usually where the video starts asking something different of you, not just noticing the problem, but noticing who's been allowed to answer it for you. Reason number 5 is the one people find hardest to talk about, because it doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who love you most. It usually starts small. Someone finishes your sentence before you get to the end of it. A doctor's appointment where the physician talks to your adult child standing beside you, instead of to you. A family decision about your house, your finances, your car keys, made in a group chat you weren't part of, to spare you the stress. This is one of the quietest forms of identity loss, because it's dressed up as love. Nobody frames it as taking something away. It's framed as help, as protection, as we're just trying to make things easier. And sometimes that's even partly true. But there's a psychological cost to being consistently spoken over instead of spoken to, decided for instead of consulted, and it's called learned helplessness. It's a well-established finding in psychology. When a person's choices are repeatedly overridden, even gently, even lovingly, they eventually start to participate less, not because they've lost the ability to decide, but because some part of them has quietly concluded that deciding doesn't matter anymore. The world has already decided for them. This is different from actual physical need for support, which is real and honest and nothing to be ashamed of. This is about something else. The difference between someone helping you carry something heavy and someone quietly taking the whole box out of your hands without asking, because it was faster that way. Your competence doesn't disappear the moment someone else finds it more convenient to act as if it has. Your voice in the room is not a courtesy extended to you. It is yours, and it was never anyone else's to manage. The families doing this rarely mean harm. Often it comes from their own fear. Watching a parent age can quietly terrify an adult child, and taking over decisions can feel, to them, like doing something useful with that fear instead of just sitting inside it helplessly. That's worth understanding, even forgiving. But understanding why it happens doesn't mean you have to accept it happening to you indefinitely. There's a real difference between saying, "I'd like your help thinking this through," and having a decision announced to you after it's already made. One keeps you as the author of your own life, with people assisting you. The other quietly demotes you to a character in someone else's story about you. You are allowed to say, gently but plainly, "I want to be part of this conversation before it's decided, not after." That single sentence, said early and said often, can do more to protect your sense of self than almost anything else in this entire list, because it reminds the people who love you that competence and old age are not opposites, no matter how convenient it sometimes is for everyone else to assume they are. That's not gratitude you owe anyone for being handled. That's a boundary you're allowed to hold, kindly but firmly, for the rest of your life. If any of that stung a little, good. It means it's true for you, and it means you're exactly the person this next reason is for. When was the last time you saw someone over 70 on a screen? In a movie, a commercial, the news? Who wasn't sick, sad, confused, or comic relief? This is reason number 6. And it's less about any one interaction and more about the entire atmosphere you've been breathing for decades. A culture that has quietly agreed your best story is already finished. Youth gets sold as the main event, the falling in love, the big adventure, the reinvention, while aging gets sold as the epilogue, the slow winding down after the real plot has ended. This isn't an accident, and it isn't really about you personally. It's a marketing habit, an entertainment habit, an advertising habit, an entire economy built on selling youth back to people, which means age has to be positioned as the thing being sold against. But here's what almost never gets said out loud in any of it. A culture's storytelling habits are not a verdict on your actual life. They're a business model, and you are allowed to simply refuse to star in the story it's trying to write for you. There is powerful, growing research on something psychologists call generativity. The drive, often strongest in the second half of life, to create meaning, mentor others, build something that outlasts you. Far from being the epilogue, many people report their most values-driven, clear-eyed, unapologetically themselves years happening well after 50, 60, 70. Not despite their age. Sometimes because of everything that age finally let them let go of. Consider what actually gets subtracted with age and what gets added before accepting the culture's math at face value. Subtracted, some physical speed, certain kinds of stamina, maybe the need to prove yourself in rooms that no longer require proving. Added, an almost unteachable sense of what actually matters versus what only felt urgent at the time. The ability to sit through a hard conversation without needing to win it. A radically clearer sense of which relationships deserve your remaining time and which never did. None of that shows up in an anti-aging advertisement because none of it can be sold in a bottle. It has to be lived into slowly, the hard way, and that is precisely why the culture's storytelling machinery has so little use for it. It can't be packaged, so it gets treated as if it doesn't exist. But the people around you who actually pay attention already know better. Ask any child which grandparent they run to first with a real problem, and it is almost never the one still chasing relevance on someone else's terms. That's not naive optimism. That's an entire body of research quietly contradicting the story you've been sold your whole life. If you're still here, and I have a feeling you are, I want to tell you something before we go any further because it's the hinge this whole video turns on. There's a quote that's followed me for years, often credited to Eleanor Roosevelt. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Read it once and it sounds almost too simple. Read it again, slowly, after everything we've just walked through together. The invisibility, the flattening label, the mirror that doesn't match, the lost role, the decisions made without you, the culture writing you out of its own stories, and it stops sounding simple at all. Sounds like a door. Every single reason we've covered so far has one thing in common. It describes what the world does. The cashier's glance, the label, the talked-over sentence, the commercial that skips you entirely. None of those, on their own, can actually reach the part of you that knows who you are. They can only reach it if you let them in. And that consent, quiet, invisible, made 100 times a day in ways you barely notice, is the one thing in this entire equation that has always only ever belonged to you. Reason number 7 is the turn this whole conversation has been building toward, and it's less a reason than it is an instruction. Reclaiming your identity was never about fighting your age. Somewhere around reason number 6, something usually starts to shift for people watching this. Not because the world suddenly changed. Didn't. The cashiers, the labels, the talked-over appointments, they're all still out there tomorrow. What shifts is the question underneath all of it. For years, maybe without even naming it, you might have been quietly trying to win an argument with time itself, trying to look younger, act younger, prove you still count by the world's own youth-obsessed scoreboard. And here is the exhausting truth about that fight. It's unwinnable because it was never actually the right fight. The real task was never staying young. It was integration, the psychological work of holding every version of yourself at once, instead of discarding the older ones to protect a fading claim on youth. The 25-year-old who was certain about everything. The 40-year-old exhausted at 2 a.m. with a sick child. The 60-year-old who finally said no to something for the first time in her life. And the person you are today, sitting here listening to this. None of those people canceled each other out. They stacked. You are not a diminished version of who you were. You are the sum of every one of them, which makes you, mathematically and psychologically, the fullest version of yourself that has ever existed. Reclaiming identity doesn't mean convincing the world you're still young. It means refusing to let the world's narrow definition of still relevant decide which parts of your long, layered self are allowed to count. There's a useful test for whether you're still fighting the old, unwinnable battle or have moved into this new one. Ask yourself, when you catch your reflection, is your first internal reaction a measurement against who you used to look like? Or is it simple recognition, the plain fact of seeing yourself? Ask yourself, when someone assumes something small and wrong about you because of your age, does it wound you because it's untrue, or because some part of you was afraid it might be true? The difference matters enormously because one reaction keeps you tethered to a scoreboard you can never win, and the other sets you free from needing to check the scoreboard at all. Integration isn't a single decision you make once. It's a daily practice, noticing the 25-year-old stubbornness in yourself and smiling instead of wincing, noticing the 40-year-old's exhaustion and honoring how hard that season actually was instead of minimizing it, letting the person you are today simply be one more chapter added to an already rich book, rather than treated as an ending anyone needs to apologize for. That's not resignation to getting older. That's the exact opposite. It's finally getting to keep all of it instead of just the parts that flatter youth. One more thing before the last reason. If you've made it this far, you already know something most people never let themselves learn until it's almost too late. And reason number 8 is going to ask you to look further ahead than you probably have in a while. Picture, for a moment, the people who will talk about you after you're gone. Not at the funeral, but years later at a kitchen table, telling a story about you to someone who never got the chance to meet you. What do you think they'll actually say? Think honestly about it. Nobody, in the history of grief, has ever sat at a table years later and said, "I really do miss her silver hair." Nobody remembers the exact shade of gray, the number on a birth certificate, the slower walk toward the end. What gets remembered, what actually survives a person, passed down like a small inheritance in story form, is the way you laughed at your own jokes before anyone else got them. The stubborn opinion you never backed down from. The way you showed up again and again, in ways that were easy to overlook in the moment and impossible to forget in hindsight. This is, in the end, the quiet answer to everything the world got wrong about you along the way. The cashier who looked past you will not be the one telling your story. The label was never going to be your legacy. The mirror's gap, the lost job title, the decisions made without you, the shows that wrote you out. None of it gets carried forward. What gets carried forward is far more precise and far kinder than any of that. The actual, specific, irreplaceable person you have been the entire time underneath every assumption anyone ever made about your hair. If you want proof of this, you likely don't have to look further than your own memory of the people you've already lost. Think of a grandparent, a parent, an old friend, a mentor who's gone now. Try, honestly, to conjure the exact color of their hair, the precise number of lines on their face in their final years. For most people, that detail arrives blurry, if it arrives at all. Now try to conjure the sound of their laugh, a phrase they always used, the particular way they made you feel walking into their kitchen. That detail usually arrives instantly, vivid, undimmed by time. That contrast is not an accident, and it is not sentimental wishful thinking. It is simply how human memory works, prioritizing feeling and character over physical appearance almost every time. Whatever the world currently insists on seeing first when it looks at you is, quite literally, the part least likely to survive in anyone's memory of you. Which means the entire premise this video started with, that your silver hair is the headline of your story, was never true in the first place. It was only ever the cover of a book nobody bothered to open. That's not a comforting story to soften the ending. That's simply, accurately, what love remembers. Which brings us back to Carol, sitting in her car, 20 minutes after a stranger decided who she was in half a second. Here's what she told me happened next. She didn't go back inside and correct him. She didn't need to. She wiped her face, looked in the rearview mirror. Not the store window this time, but her own mirror on her own terms, and said, out loud to no one but herself, "That boy doesn't get to finish my sentence." Then she drove home and called her daughter not to complain, but just to talk, the way she'd always talked to her, about nothing and everything, exactly like the whole, undiminished person she has always been. She still gets called sweetheart sometimes. That part of the world hasn't changed. What changed is that she stopped needing it to. That's the gap we opened with, the space between who you are and who a stranger decides you are in half a second. And here's the honest, unglamorous truth about closing it. You don't close it by making the world look harder. You close it by refusing to hand your own reflection over to people who were never going to look closely enough to earn it. Your identity was never actually sitting in that cashier's eyes, or in a doctor's clipboard, or in a commercial that forgot to cast anyone over 60. It was always exactly where it is right now, in the person who just spent 35 minutes listening closely enough to recognize every single piece of themselves in a stranger's video. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. If any part of this felt like it was written specifically for you, it probably was, not because I know you, but because this room, this channel, is full of people quietly doing the same brave, unglamorous work of holding on to themselves. If you want more of these conversations, the honest kind, the kind that doesn't talk down to you or rush past the hard parts, stay a while longer. Subscribe if this found you at the right moment, not because a channel needs the number, but because there's more of this waiting for you whenever you're ready for it. Either way, thank you for spending this time with me today. You were seen this whole time. I hope it felt that way.